Welcome everyone. Good Monday morning. My name is Heather Miller. I am an adult programming librarian here at the La Crosse Public Library, and I'm so glad you could join us this morning for our presentation, Birds in Legend and Lore, with Gwen Calvetti. Gwen is a member of the Audubon Society and an avid storyteller, and we're very much looking forward to her performance today. So thanks for joining us, Gwen.
Thank you for having me. My name is Gwen Calvetti. And as Heather said, I'm an avid birder. I have been since I was grade school. And I currently serve as the secretary and newsletter editor of the Coulee Region Audubon Society, which covers our area. We meet the third Wednesday of every month, September through June. And we are currently meeting via Zoom. As of January. Our next meeting in March will feature Carla Bloom from the International Owl Center, and she'll be doing a program about Minnie Houston, which is a small traveling stuffed owl that goes around to all kinds of areas around the world and participates in research and programming in other areas. So those meetings are at 7, and we invite anybody to come. About myself, this program, besides my love of birds, came out of something that I did when I was still a teacher. I retired almost 10 years ago as a speech and language pathologist for the school district of La Crosse. And back in the day when we could still check our email over lunch and not get in trouble for it, I would see along about late April and May, I'd see all the postings on the birding lists that I subscribed to about this bird and that bird and all the migration. And I was stuck in a windowless classroom. But then I started thinking about that and I thought, well, I was at Southern Bluffs at the time, so I had some area nearby. And I started thinking, my kids with language learning disabilities, I can get them out looking for birds and use those things to get them to work on their IEP goals, like making comparisons or descriptive language. So it was kind of a way to legally play hooky for my job. And part of what I did was take a class, a week-long class at Trees for Tomorrow called Birding by Habitat. And we had to do a Keystone project. And my Keystone project included developing this program. So I will intersperse my stories with a little bit of information and maybe some book recommendations because this is a library program. And this is the first time I've done a live Zoom storytelling program, so it's going to seem a little weird to me and maybe to those of you too, but we'll get through it. So the first story I want to tell you is one that came from England. I modified it a little bit because we have different birds here, and that's one thing I should mention. Any story that I tell in this program, it's okay if the birds talk and argue and do things like that, but I want the birds in my stories to be like the birds they are so that they have that educational value. And this one is called Magpie Builds a Nest. Back in the early times when the animals were still learning how to behave, Magpie was flying about constructing a nest. She was gathering up little bits of mud in her beak and flying to a spot where she thought she would build her nest. And Blackbird happened to come by and said, "Magpie, what in the world are you doing?" "Oh, well, I'm building a nest." Blackbird said, "A nest? What is a nest?" "I'm building a place where I can live and I can lay my eggs and raise my babies. It'll be wonderful." Well, none of the other birds had heard of such a thing. And Blackbird was so excited, he went flying about and gathered up many of the birds who all came and sat in the trees or on the ground and watched to see what Magpie would do. Well, Magpie first gathered up the mud and formed a little cup. And the swallows were watching and went, "Oh, this is a wonderful idea. Let's go gather up some mud and we'll put it somewhere and build our own nests." And so that's what the swallows did. Now, Magpie looked at her little mud cup and thought, well, that looks pretty good, but I need to do more. And so she started gathering up dried stalks of grass and reeds and things like that and circling the outside edge to provide a little layer of strength. Blackbird looked at this and thought, wow, I kind of see the idea here. And so from that day till now, Blackbird gathers up reeds and sticks and little bits of things and weaves it together where it can lay its eggs in the marsh. Well, Magpie kept watching all the birds watching her, and she looked at her nest and thought, yeah, this needs a little more work. And so she started gathering up small sticks, just little tiny twigs that had fallen off the trees in the wind, and wove them around the outside edge of her nest. Sparrow watched and went, oh, this is a marvelous idea. I can handle little bitty sticks. And so sparrows from that day till this build their nests with small little sticks. Now the next one to watch happened to be crow. Now we all know crow is always watching, always observing, very smart. And crow watched as Magpie picked up some larger sticks and put them at the base to protect it from any kind of falling. And crow thought, aha, I can handle big sticks. And so from that day till this, crow would build a nest with large sticks in a pile. Now, Magpie thought she was finished, and she kind of settled down and moved around in her nest and kind of smoothed out the mud, but it was still kind of bumpy and lumpy and didn't feel at all comfortable for little babies. So she started plucking downy feathers from her own breast and lined the inside cup of her nest to make it soft. Starling watched, and Starling thought, uh-huh, that'll work for me too. Well, all of the birds had supposedly gotten their lessons about nests, but there was one who kind of fluttered in with noisy wings and sat down next to Magpie on her nest and started calling, "Make two, Maggie, make two." Magpie took a look at Mourning Dove and just shook her head and settled back down in, but Mourning Dove continued, "Make two, Maggie, make two. Make two, Maggie, make two. I don't need two nests." And she tried to ignore again, but Mourning Dove continued on, "Make two, Maggie, make two. Make two, Maggie, make two." On and on and on until finally Magpie squawked and said, "Ah, I'm done with all the rest of you. If you haven't figured out how to build your own nests, too bad for you." Owl happened to be listening and found some old crow nests. To this day, Owl doesn't bother to build a nest of its own. So it did listen. And that is how they say the birds learn to build their nests. Now, I'll share a book that's a really fascinating book for me, maybe not for everyone else. Let me see if I can get this. Okay, it's the Peterson's Guide to bird nests, and unfortunately, they did not get a magpie nest in here, but there's lots of other nests in here that somehow people managed to get up close to bird nests. I don't recommend this, it's not a good idea, but they managed to get these pictures together and create a field guide so that if you're out looking and you happen upon a nest or you happen upon eggs, it's a great thing to look at. You have to be a bird geek to really like this, but I am. So, okay, I need to get one thing ready for my next one. Okay, hopefully this works. One of the joys of birds that I think even the non-bird people love is listening to their songs. Now, this is a story that comes from the Mohawk Nation. I will say I am not Native American. I have talked to some of my Native American friends about retelling their stories, and I have been working to create my own stories so that I don't have to appropriate somebody else's culture. But I've had friends say, please learn about our culture, share these stories, but share them as ours, not yours. So with that, I will tell you about how the birds got song. In the long ago time, the people would gather at night around their fires and they would sing beautiful songs, beautiful chants. And the birds had not learned how to sing. The birds would sit up in the trees at dusk and listen and hear these beautiful voices soaring up to the heavens. And they wished they could do the same. Well, the creator of all things noticed how the birds always would gather and listen, and one day called a council of the birds and said, would you all like to be able to sing your own songs? Oh, we would. The feathers were flapping. We would love to. How can we do this? The creator said, well, we're going to have a contest of sorts. Gather here in 4 days' time, right at dawn, and I will sound a signal and you will all fly up into the sky. The higher you fly, the more beautiful your song. Oh, the birds were so excited. The night sleepers could hardly sleep the next few nights. Now, eagle can go higher and higher and higher until that huge bird looks like a dot in the sky. So eagle figured he would get the best song of them all. And then there was little hermit thrush, small, rather drab, a little bit of orange on the top of its butt, but nothing distinctive about it otherwise. And it wasn't a big flyer, but it had an idea. If it could just creep in and bury itself right above eagle's tail feathers, it could ride the currents of air up to the top and then leave and maybe grab the best song of all. And so that's what hermit thrush did. The morning came and the signal was given, and the birds arose in a blast of feathers. Some of them didn't get very far. Crow went up a bit and then caw, caw, caw. That's the best he could get. Others were able to get a little higher. Phoebe caught up and went, Phoebe, 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 Phoebe. And so it went as the different birds got up, and when they ran out of energy, they grabbed the song closest to them, each one a little more beautiful than the next. Eagle had kept his mouth quiet because he knew he would get the best one of all. And he got up to the top, pushing his range for even him, when suddenly he felt something scratching just above his tail feathers. He turned and looked, and with the angry look that only an eagle can have, saw little hermit thrush creeping out and launching off into the air even higher. Hermit thrush rose as high as he could, and he grabbed a song like no other. Hopefully you can hear it. He had grabbed the most beautiful song of all, and Eagle was so angry he plummeted down just like an eagle going for a fish and got nothing more than a funny sound that didn't even sound majestic. All the other birds were so mad at Hermit Thrush because Hermit Thrush, really, let's face it, he cheated his way to the most beautiful song. And so that is why, especially in the woods of the north, in the spring and early summer, if you are walking about, you will hear that beautiful song more than you will ever find the bird that it comes from, because Hermit Thrush, from that day, has been hiding low in the brush, afraid that Eagle is coming back to steal the song that should have been his. And that is how the Mohawks say the birds got their songs. Okay, and there are lots and lots of apps. If you're interested in bird song, I go through this process every spring where I actually have CDs. They're the Stokes Guide to bird songs, and I'll listen to them over and over and over again because I have to relearn all the migrant birds. Not all of them. Hermit thrush, I know. But there are also a lot of apps that you can buy that have bird song. The one that I used just now was, let me go back. It's called iBird Pro. It's not the cheapest one out there, but it has a nice variety of songs and really good information. There are also, I think Merlin, the Merlin app may have bird calls on it. I know a lot of my friends that are casual birders like the Merlin app, and I believe it does have bird song as well. So it's a fun thing to do because you start to notice things that have always been there, but you hadn't paid attention before. And it's an especially good way if you're serious about trying to spot the birds, to know what you're looking for, and to know where too. If I hear that song, I know that there's not a lot of point in looking up because hermit thrush is going to be down low in the shrub level. So that's kind of a fun thing to share there. Now, the next story is one that I did create for myself. I created it after I had observed an interaction between a couple of species of birds while I was hiking down in the Myrick Marsh one summer afternoon. Eagles are often seen, and of course the red-winged blackbirds are everywhere. So this is my own personal Pourquoi tale about how red-winged blackbird got his red shoulder patches. It was early spring, and red-winged blackbird had staked out his territory among the marsh reeds, And he had gathered his little harem of ladies who were all sitting in their nests, and he was doing what red-winged blackbirds do when announcing their territory. Lovely song. He didn't get very high in the sky, but it works. And he was sitting there one summer afternoon when he noticed Eagle circling above and zeroing in on a fish in the water. He dove in, he grabbed the fish, he flew off to a dead tree snag across the marsh. Well, he was a little close, but far enough away so that red-winged blackbird didn't feel that he needed to worry about it. But it had been one of those especially rainy summers. The water went up higher and higher and spread closer and closer to the reed bed where his harem was. And he was sitting there one afternoon guarding against all the others when Eagle came down looking for lunch and came just a little bit too close. Not quite close, but close enough that Blackbird felt he needed to rush out and chase him. Eagle kind of looked, and it was an inconsequential bird, so he grabbed his fish and off he went to the tree snag where he worked on it. More rains came. The water spread even further. And Blackbird became to be very concerned because with each passing day, as the water rose and rose and rose, Eagle would come closer and closer and closer until finally one afternoon when Eagle was fishing, totally oblivious to any of the blackbirds there, because who were they? They were just blackbirds. There's so many of them. And he came down and a fish was very close to a couple of the nests. He came down at that fish and he grabbed it, and Blackbird came after him and grabbed at his tail feathers and hung on. As Eagle was trying to reach up, he dropped the fish, and then he was not a happy Eagle. But Blackbird hung on, and Eagle turned around and snapped at him to chase him away, but Blackbird hung on tight. He was not going to let anyone mess with his territory, not even Eagle. And Eagle started to roll over, and he grabbed at Blackbird and shook his tail feathers, and Blackbird flew off but came after him. Eagle grabbed at Blackbird by wings right where they joined his body and shook him hard and then dropped him. Blackbird fluttered back down to his territory, and he looked and saw that now, where there had been only black, there were two bold red bloody patches. He wore those patches with pride because he knew that meant he had chased Eagle away and protected his harem. And from that day to this, all of the male red-winged blackbirds wear those patches with pride, letting the eagle remember they might be a little bird, but you don't want to mess with them at all. Got my little notes here. Now I'm going to mention another book. This is an awesome book. It's The Genius of Birds by Jennifer Ackerman. And I'm in a book club, and the people in the book club always kind of expect me to pick something science-based or bird-based. And I'm always being really careful because they aren't all as crazy about birds as I am. And this had been my bird pick, but the woman who picks the books just ahead of me, she also likes nature-based books. She picked this book. And it's a great book for anyone who's just interested in natural history. You don't have to be a bird geek. Everyone in my book club absolutely loved this book. It does talk about crows and how smart they really are. They are amazingly smart birds, but not just crows. And it covers things like their migration patterns and all the rest of that, but in a very engaging way. And a friend of mine is actually quoted in it. So who's going to be our speaker in May, Laura Erickson, for Audubon. Laura Erickson is an ornithologist who lives in Duluth. She's widely known throughout the birding community and does amazingly wonderful programs. And she's going to be presenting her Into the Nest by Zoom for our May Cooley Audubon meeting. So if you're interested in anything like that, please look it up. We do have a Facebook page and we keep updated on there, or you can look up Cooley Region Audubon Society and it'll be on our website as well. So, okay, my next story is one that actually comes from Korea, and it's from a book called Tales of a Korean Grandfather. And here's an interesting side note. I attended one of the International Owl Center's programs a couple of months ago. They do virtual programs every Sunday afternoon. And if you're looking for something to do, those are always fun too. And this one was actually on birds and or myths of birds, I think was what it was. And in some parts of the world, owls are somewhat persecuted because of various negative images they have. I know that in some Native American cultures, not all, seeing an owl is regarded as a bad sign because it means there will be a death. We have protections here in the United States, but that isn't true around the world. And in Korea, the presenter was doing a lot of work on helping to dispel those images. And I learned of a really fascinating program they do in Korea. They have story grandmas. It's a 2-year training program. And these women learn all of the folklore, the traditional Korean folklore, and they go around to schools and community groups and share those stories. And that was part of the program to help dispel some of the owl fear. So I find this interesting, but it's not an owl. It's actually about a crane. This is a whooping crane. I was able to go when they were still doing flight training in Necedah National Wildlife. Wisconsin Ornithology Society would do these field trips, and I signed on to a field trip and got to watch the flight training, and then they took us through some of the closed areas in the refuge. And this whooping crane, this was actually one of the first successful breeding pairs in the state. It had been harassing the trainers earlier. It was posing beautifully for me, and you could not get out of the vehicle. But the rangers slowed the vehicle to a crawl so that I could shoot through a window. I was just thrilled to see that. So this is called a story for sale. Mr. and Mrs. Yee were an old couple who lived in a mountain location away from everyone else. Their home was surrounded by a stone wall, and they had no children. Every night, after they had finished all of their chores, they would sit out on their veranda and stare into the darkness. Mrs. Yee would look at Mr. Yee and say, "Can you tell me a story?" And Mr. Yee would say, "I don't have any stories worth telling." And then they would sit in silence. Now, it just so happened that they had a considerable savings set aside that they kept in a kimchi jar, which they hid in their home. And one night, when Mrs. Yee asked the same question, "Can you tell me a story?" and Mr. Yee said, "I don't have a story," she finally said, "Why don't you go into town, take some of our savings, and buy us a story?" Mr. Yee looked at her and said, "You would want me to spend our savings on a story?" She said, "Well, yes. Otherwise, what are we doing? Sitting on our savings in silence, night after night?" Mr. Yee couldn't argue with that. Mr. Yee knew better than to argue with Mrs. Yee. So the next morning, he got 100 strings of cash out of their kimchi jar, and he set off down the mountain from their stronghold in search of a story. He eventually got to the low, flat plains, and he came to a farmer working along his rice fields. And he bowed and said hello, and the farmer returned the bow and said hello. And Mr. Yee looked at the farmer and he said, "Do you have a story you could sell me?" Well, the farmer no more had a story than Mr. Yee did, and he probably even had less imagination. But he heard the words "to sell," and farmers can always use some extra cash. He said, "Well, yes, I do have a story, and it's a very good one, but it will cost some money. How much do you have?" Mr. Yee said, "Well, I have 100 strings of cash." The farmer could not believe his luck. "All right, for that, I can give you an excellent story." But he didn't have a story at all. But as he sat there and said, "Let me think, I need to get this story just right," he looked out across the rice field beyond them, and there at the edge was a crane fishing for snails and frogs and whatever else it might find. He watched the crane as the crane stopped and stopped, stopped and stopped. And he said, "Step by step, nearer he comes. Step by step, he comes nearer." And Mr. Yee repeated it word for word so that he would remember it exactly. Step by step, nearer he comes. Step by step, he comes nearer. Okay. The crane suddenly stopped because it had spotted prey, probably. It tipped its head and watched. The farmer said, "Now he stops to look. Now he stops to listen." Mr. Yee, "Now he stops to look, now he stops to listen." Okay. All of a sudden, the crane crouched very low and stretched its neck out long. The farmer said, "Now he bends, now he creeps." Now he bends, now he creeps. At that very moment, nearby, a fox poked its nose just up above the rice plants, and the crane caught sight of it and lifted its wings and soared away. Now he flees. Now he is safe. That is all. Mr. Yee looked at the farmer and he said, "That's the story?" And the farmer said, "Yes. What more could one want?" "Well, yes, I'm sure, but are you sure you haven't forgotten anything?" The farmer said, "No, that is all." Mr. Yee handed over his cash and walked all the way back up the mountain, rehearsing the story the whole time. When he arrived, Mrs. Yee said, "Did you get a story?" He said, "Yes, I got us an excellent story. Let us do the rest of our chores and then I will tell it." They went out on the veranda in the dark and Mr. Yee began. Step by step, nearer he comes. Step by step, he comes nearer. Now he looks, now he listens. He bends, he creeps, he escapes. Now he is safe. Mrs. Yee looked at Mr. Yee and said, "Is that all?" And he said, "What more could you want?" "Well, indeed, I guess you're right." And every night they would go out on the veranda and they would tell that story to each other, turning it over this way and that way, thinking about all the possible meanings and interpretations, and they were very happy with their story. Now, the bandits and thieves who worked the mountain passes had heard about that kimchi jar and the treasure it held. And one young, particularly brash young bandit decided he was going to get rich. And so one night in the dark, he carefully climbed over that stone wall and dropped quietly onto the other side, where he heard voices coming from the veranda. Step by step, nearer he comes. Step by step, he comes nearer. Oh, how can they see me? It's dark. There is no moon tonight. The clouds are out. And yet somehow they know I'm here. That can't be right. And so the thief froze in his spot, turned his head to listen, and he heard, now he looks, now he listens. These people, they must have some magic that allows them to see in the dark. And so he waited for a long, long time. And then he got down very low to the ground and began to creep ever so slowly, closer and closer and closer. And he heard the voice say, he creeps, he bends. It's true. And he went flying back for the wall and scrambled up. And as he was ready to drop onto the other side, he heard, now he flees, now he is safe. Oh, the thief could not believe how lucky he had been to get away with his life. And he told everyone who worked those circles never to go near that house. And Mr. Yee and Mrs. Yee happily told their story every night, and anyone who even thought about climbing over that wall heard them and knew it was true. Okay, this last story that I'm going to tell comes from the Hechiti culture. The Hechiti are part of the Creek Nation of Southeast United States. We spent last year this time in Natchez, Mississippi, and developed a lot of interest in the tribes of that part of our country. And while the Hechiti do have a center in Alabama, they've largely been assimilated in, and where some of the people that followed the trail were forced on the Trail of Tears. But I like this particular story because you'll recognize it, I'm sure, even though it isn't the way you've heard it before. Heron and Hummingbird were great friends, even though Heron was tall and gangly and kind of awkward, and Hummingbird was swift and fast and flashy. They both loved to eat fish. Yes, fish. Hummingbird would eat the tiniest little minnows, and Heron would fish for the bigger ones and take them down his gullet. But one day, Hummingbird looked at his friend Heron and said, "You know, I'm afraid there may come a time when there aren't enough fish for both of us. Maybe we need to do something about that." And Heron thought about that and said, "You're right. What do you think we should do?" The Hummingbird said, "You know, I think we could have a race. Let's have a race. We'll race for 4 days to that old dead tree on the other side of the river. And whichever one of us is sitting at the top of that dead tree on the morning of the 4th day, they get all the fish. How's that sound?" And Heron said, "Well, that maybe is a good plan. Let's do it. We'll do it tomorrow." And so the next morning, they met at their favorite meeting spot, and the race was on. Now, Heron flapped with a steady, slow wing beat, his legs trailing behind, his neck kind of leading. Whereas Hummingbird, of course, flitted around a million miles an hour, zipping in front of Heron and chatting, but then, oh, what a pretty flower! And off went Hummingbird to check out the flower. And Hummingbird found, oh, it has some pretty sweet nectar. And he started going for the flowers. They were red, I believe they were cardinal flowers, and nipping at the nectar when he looked up and he saw, oh, Heron is ahead of me. And so off he went, zipping around, but again, spotting flowers and then catching up to Heron and passing him way up. Heron, meanwhile, continued, flapping steadily. The end of the first night, Hummingbird was tired and needed a rest, and so he found a nice little perch somewhere, while Heron kept on through the night. Hummingbird woke up and he saw that Heron had pulled ahead of him. He must have been flying all night because he'd left him behind in the dust at sunset the night before. And so he zipped on ahead, but oh, red flowers, I'm going to go check those out. Oh, there's some bee balm, I'll have some of that too. And then he'd zip ahead. The race went on the same way. The next 2 nights, Hummingbird would nap, Heron would flap, and Hummingbird would zip ahead until the morning of the 4th day. Hummingbird was sure he had left Heron so far behind he couldn't see even that great big bird. And so he got up in the morning and he zipped off. He was almost to that tree when he looked, and there, silhouetted at the top of the tree snag, was Heron with a fish in its beak. Hummingbird said, "You're right. You shall have all the fish of the lakes and the ponds and the rivers, but I've discovered something pretty tasty myself." And that is why the Hechiti people say, Hummingbird likes to sip of the nectar of the flowers he discovered during that race. I will show you a couple more books. This one is an absolute favorite. It is Kingbird Highway by Ken Kaufman. Ken Kaufman is another noted birder, but it's his memoir. He was about 18 years old, dropped out of high school, and decided he was going to hitchhike to do a big year. Now he's about my age. So this was in the 70s when hitchhiking was much more acceptable. And he's another author who can write about bird stuff, but it's universal for anybody, especially people of, I'm assuming most of us are the same generation, who might have had a little wanderlust and maybe did a little hitchhiking or backpacking or whatever. I highly recommend it. Early in the pandemic, when the libraries were closed and I'd run out of books to read, it was the first one I reread. Another one, I think this was Science Book of the Year or something, a couple of years ago, that my mother gave me. It's called Mozart's Starling. The author is Leanda Lynn Haupt. And apparently, back when Mozart was living in Vienna, the bird trade was very popular and people would capture birds and then sell them. And the story goes that he was walking down the street from where he was living and working on one of his pieces, and he heard a starling that was singing this piece he had been writing. And so he had to have this starling. And the woman who wrote the book is a bird rehabber, and she kept a starling. And she goes back and forth between starling behavior, her experiences trying to rehab this bird, and what she could find out about Mozart. They are amazing mimics. They can copy all kinds of things. It's more, I don't want to admit how many times on the Christmas bird count, my partner and I, who's an even more accomplished birder, have almost fallen for a starling trying to trick us into thinking it's something really cool that would be neat to find in December. Bird field guides, there are apps all over, but I say there's nothing better than a good old-fashioned bird book. And there are so many. I have probably all of them. This one is the National Geographic Field Guide to the Birds of North America. You may have seen the Golden books. That was my first one. But I keep them in my car if I'm waiting somewhere. I like to just look through them and study the birds and the field marks. And I really do believe that it makes me a better birder. And if you have grandkids, as I do, and they're both great little birders, especially my grandson, who's 11, I have this National Audubon Society First Field Guide to Birds, and it doesn't have everything, but I keep it in the car. And my grandson lives in Colorado now, but before he moved, the two kids would sit in the back seat and they'd be quizzing each other on stuff from this book and playing little games. And it's a nice book. I'll try one more thing, and I'm going to ask for some audience participation. I broke my wrist a month ago. I had metal stuff put in my wrists, so my hands are a little bit, they're getting better, but I'm a little handicapped here. But we all know that birds have value to our environment, not only for our own well-being, but as pest control, as, different things to help with the ecosystem. Some of them are prey birds, some of them are prey themselves, but they all have a place in the circle of life. Now, there's one creature that I think no one would argue with me that it's a useful creature to have. Fortunately, it's winter and we don't have to deal with them right now. But nobody likes mosquitoes. Nobody. They're annoying. They suck blood. They're just annoying. And if you've got a mosquito buzzing around about, take your hands, form a beak, and clap it for me. Swallows, nightjars, all of those birds will eat those mosquitoes for us. And so that's kind of the end of things. If people have questions,